We are very fortunate to have Dan Kennedy from the School of Journalism with us. I want to say a couple of things by way of introduction of Dan. He's a professor here at Northeastern. He teaches news reporting, media law, and other journalism courses with an emphasis on blogging, multimedia, and social networks. For those of you who watch WGBH, Dan is a regular panelist every Friday afternoon on Emily Rooney's program where they do a segment called Beat the Press. And it's a review of happenings in the world of press and news media in the previous week. It's very good. I encourage you to watch it. He regularly contributes commentaries on media and politics to the Huffington Post, has written for The Guardian, Neiman Reports, Neiman Journalism Lab, Slate, the online magazine started by Microsoft in the 90s, the Boston Globe, Commonwealth Magazine, and many other publications. We're very fortunate to have Dan, and I think I will hand it off to you to do your bit, and then we'll sit down and have a conversation. So, welcome, Dan Kennedy.
Thank you so much. Professor Thrush is trying something new by having me in here. He's having someone with no visual sense talk to you about design. So this will be fun. He also told me that one of the organizing principles of this series is to talk about what sort of questions design is meant to answer. And what I think is interesting about the direction that news design has taken in the years since the rise of the commercial web in the mid-90s is that we have gradually come to see that the design approach that we've been taking is an answer to the wrong question. And I think we know that now, but I also think that we're still kind of struggling to get it right and to see what the implications of what we now understand about the medium, how that will affect design. Now, one of the things that preparing for this talk required me to do was to kind of think about what news design is for. And I am going to be talking about newspaper design before we get to some of the internet matter, because there's a long and noble and distinguished history of newspaper design and a very short history of internet design. So I'm not sure that, I think that it's important to understand where the news that we get today, where it originally came from. And I think that over time. The first of them is that it lets us know what the editors think are the day's top stories. And the one I put up here is really kind of a gimme, isn't it? Obviously, the second inauguration of President Obama was the big news story of the day. And the New York Times and just about every other newspaper put themselves to work at the task of displaying that in a way that really brought home the importance of it. So, what are the top stories of the day? I think the second part of newspaper design is that the organization of the newspaper helps us move quickly through a lot of news. It helps us read and it helps us skim. There have been studies that show that newspaper readers spend about maybe 15 to 20 minutes with the daily paper. Those are our best customers. And they might read 10 to 12% of the news. So here's where you have conventions such as where the story is placed in the paper helps you know how important it is. The headline generally is not a title. It's a headline. It's almost like a telegraphic summation of what the story is. And you might find that the headline is all you need to know, and you move on. And usually less so today than in the past, because You may have heard, I don't know, how many of you have ever heard of the inverted pyramid? Okay, it's a style of news writing in which the most important news goes right in the lead paragraph, and then gradually less and less important things develop. It's not used as much today because story after story in that form can be deadly to read, but it's still used for certain types of news, and you certainly should be able to glance at the first 2 or 3 paragraphs of a story and get the gist of it, and you may find that that's enough. So again, you get, what are the day's top stories? How can I navigate through the news as quickly as possible? And then the third reason is pure marketing. It's how can we convince you to pick up a copy of the paper on your way to work? And this is still an important consideration for newspaper publishers, even though the people who still read the paper in print, and I'm 56 years old, and I am barely in that category at this point. So I can only imagine what your habits are. But the people who still get that paper delivered at home, they still want to try to appeal to a small extra audience that will make a point-of-purchase decision in the morning as to whether they're going to grab the paper or not. Just a quick aside as to how important this can be. 10 to 15 years ago, when the Boston Herald was a more robust competitor to the Globe than it is today, the Herald had a higher circulation in Suffolk County than the Globe did, even though the Globe's circulation was vastly larger than the Herald's. And the reason for this was that the Globe was almost entirely home delivery, and the Herald was almost entirely an impulse buy. People would buy it on their way to work in Boston. That's why the circulation of the Herald was higher in Boston than the Globe. So the Herald had to put this enormous premium on putting together the most enticing front page possible. And they did a very good job of it. If you see the Herald today, it's kind of, the front page looks more desperate than it does enticing a lot of days. But back 10 or 15 years ago, they really did a good job of grabbing local readers. Now, if those are the 3 things that newspaper design is aimed at accomplishing, how do we do with web news design? Well, I would argue that web fails on all 3 levels. It doesn't do a good job of telling us what the most important news of the day is. It doesn't help us navigate the news quickly. And in very few cases does it really help us decide whether we're going to dive in or not. This is a recent homepage of Yahoo News. Yahoo is better than a lot. And this is, I picked it because it's ugly and hard to navigate, but it's not exceptionally ugly or hard to navigate as news sites go. Now the question becomes, does it matter? Does it matter that web design for news continues to be really unattractive and not useful? Well, the answer is, of course it matters. But nevertheless, in some ways, that's the wrong question. We tend to think of online design as an updated version of print. It's very difficult to get beyond feeling like, well, this is just like the newspaper, except that it's on a screen and we can add video and we can add certain other features. Very hard to get past that way of thinking about web design. But our old friend Marshall McLuhan observed that the medium is the message. Now, McLuhan could be extremely cryptic, and it was sometimes hard to know what he meant. But what he meant in part by the medium is the message is that no new medium is simply an updated version of the previous medium, even though we all think it is at the time. When radio came along, we said, this is an audio version of print. Well, of course it isn't. And radio was very quickly put to very different purposes than print. We've come a long way from the days when Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York would read the funnies on the radio during a New York newspaper strike. It doesn't work. TV is not radio with pictures, and the internet is not just a new combination of text, audio, video, pictures. It's something different, and McLuhan would have understood that instinctively. In many ways, his work kind of predicted the internet many years before it came into existence. What the internet is about is print is about authority. Online is about sharing and community. And so therefore, I'll get to this more later, but now we're going to take a little bit of a historical tour. But in essence, all of the work that we put into designing nice news websites is, I'm not going to say it's a waste. Attractive is better than ugly. But nevertheless, it's a bit of an answer to the wrong question. Now, design of the news has tended to reflect cultural change over the years. Of course, it reflects technological change as well. I was reading a book about news design through the years recently in preparation for this talk. And the authors of the book talked about how changes in design reflected changes in what we were looking to newspapers for. So if we go back to the colonial and the federal period, this is clearly the colonial period. The papers became much more sophisticated looking as we got into the early 1800s. But nevertheless, we kind of have these stately columns of type for a fledgling democracy. You had an elite readership. It was very expensive to produce newspapers. So not that many people read them. They did not come out daily. They came out maybe 1, 2, or 3 days a week. They tended to circulate around the local tavern where people would read them and discuss public affairs and politics. Now, we get into the 1830s, and now we start to get something like a paper aimed at a mass market. Now, what's interesting about this is the New York Sun, the very first penny press newspaper. And this was, technology came in and turned the news business upside down. Sound familiar? The 1830s was the first great technological revolution in news. You'd say that Gutenberg was, but nobody did news with the printing press for a couple of hundred years after Gutenberg. Technology came along. Cheap, mechanized presses allowed the printing of huge numbers of newspapers, and you could sell them for a penny. So now you're trying to appeal to a mass audience. You're no longer trying to appeal to an elite audience to discuss politics. Now, this is kind of boring looking because there was no way of getting photos in the paper, but we're nevertheless moving toward a mass audience. The New York Sun was famous in the 1830s. You may have heard that we landed on the moon in 1969. In the 1830s, the New York Sun had a whole series of reports on the first humans to land on the moon. So, you know, they beat everybody by a good 140 years. Now, if we get to the Victorian period in the late 1800s, this is one of the most famous front pages in newspaper history. It's William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal after the explosion of the Maine in Cuba. And this is what led to the Spanish-American War. Hearst was a great enthusiast for the war. It's sometimes said that we may not have gone to war if it weren't for what Hearst was doing in his newspaper every day. Now, this is pretty confusing to look at, isn't it? And I wish I could have found a more representative front page from the New York Journal rather than the most famous one ever. But in general, what they would do is there'd just be everything all over the place because they weren't really sure who was interested in what. And so therefore, there would just be kind of an explosion of stories all over the place, not well organized, and yet it made sense to the readership of the day. We get into the 20th century, we get the tabloid press. This is one of the early editions of the New York Daily News. This is also one of the most famous front pages in history. A photographer snuck in a camera strapped to his ankle and got a picture of a notorious murderer. I suppose they would have called her a murderess, named Ruth Snyder, and took a picture of her as she was being electrocuted for her crime. And there it is, dead. 50 years after the founding of the New York Daily News, they published this wonderful commemorative book, and I got a copy of it. And I love the lengths that they go to say that the public service that this front page accomplished, that it eventually led to the abolition of the death penalty in New York, and blah, blah, blah. That had nothing to do with it. Come on. They wanted to get a picture of Ruth Snyder getting executed. There's an alternate headline because papers would publish different editions throughout the day. And the headline was, "When Ruth Paid Her Debt to the State." Good yellow stuff. Now here we have the professional press, the modern newspaper starting to slip into view. This is a typical front page of the New York Herald Tribune, a great, great newspaper that died in the New York newspaper strikes of the 1960s. A true competitor to the New York Times in many ways, but it was not able to make it across the finish line. Now you start to see some of the conventions that we see today coming into view. There's an attempt to sort the news out by importance. The most important story of the day is in the upper right, which is a long-standing convention. Nobody's quite sure how that came to be. One legend is that you make up, back in the days of hot type, you would make up newspapers backwards. And naturally, you start in the upper left, right? Well, the upper left would become the upper right when you would print it. So as legend would have it, that may be why the most important story is in the upper right. So this would kind of be the emerging of a professional journalism that we had not had before. You get into the 1970s, and there was this real cookie-cutter attempt to come up with what is sometimes referred to as the modernist style, and this might be called the corporate press. It, again, is an attempt to sort the news according to what was most important, but it was a greatly simplified approach compared to what we saw in the New York Herald Tribune. And unlike the great press barons like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, now you're kind of getting into faceless corporations, publicly traded companies. This was the era when newspapers may have very well gone off the rails. They were cutting back on coverage, earning profit margins of as much as 30 or 40%. Because they had this wonderful local monopoly. And pretty soon it all got swept away, as I think we know. And then finally, we kind of have the neo-Victorian look of USA Today. And I've gone back to USA Today before its redesign of last summer because they have finally simplified it a bit. And I wanted to kind of show you a front page of USA Today in all of its neo-Victorian glory. As you see, it's a bit of a mess, kind of like the New York Journal, despite innovations such as color. Nobody had ever done much with color before USA Today. And again, it's because you've got this faceless national audience. And the owners of USA Today, the Gannett Corporation, really had no idea who their readers were. So they would just throw as much against the wall as they possibly could to see what would stick. There's a real mock USA Today tone to The Onion. So if you are a reader of The Onion, you kind of have a feel for what USA Today is like. It's like the Onion played straight. Now I'd like to turn our attention to online news design. And obviously the history is not as broad or deep, and a lot of this simply represents my opinion of what's going on. This may be the world's ugliest news site. It is called News Junkie. You can look it up. I wish I could scroll down because it gets worse. It is absolutely unbelievable. It is this total hodgepodge of just stuff everywhere. It's mainly an aggregation site. It's basically links to every story that they can find in north central New York State. It's fairly successful. People seem to like it. Maybe it would be more successful if it didn't look like this. But then again, the Drudge Report's very successful, and it only looks a little bit better than this. However, here's the home page of the New York Times. It's a lot more elegant looking in terms of its typography, but if you are a visitor to the New York Times home page, and I'm talking only about the home page, there are many, many different ways that the New York Times has tried to solve the online news design problem, and this is just one of them. But again, if you scroll down, it gets more and more dense and hard to navigate. And it just isn't very useful. And you think about that wonderfully elegant front page that they did the day after the president's inauguration. You can see that there's quite a bit of difference here. There is a huge problem with web design. There are three problems. You notice everything comes in threes. In journalism, we say if you can find three, there's a trend, and then you can go do a trend story. So we tend to think in threes. The first problem is that the limited real estate of a screen, as opposed to not just a large newspaper page, but you've also got many pages inside to work with. The limits of the screen makes it difficult to emulate the newspaper's traditional strengths. Another problem is that I think this is fear of failure. Early on, we got an ethos that you had to put everything on the home page. Now, when you put out a print product, you tease a few things. You want people to know what the best stuff is on the front, whether it's the front of a newspaper, the front of a magazine. But you're also content to let people discover a lot of stuff as they flip through it, right? With the home page of a news website and many other types of websites, it seems that somebody decided early on that if we don't put everything that we have somewhere on the home page, it will get lost. And the result, of course, is that everything gets lost. So that's another problem. And finally, the third problem, I shouldn't say problem. This is the beginning of, I think, what we've seen as a more successful type of web design. We've seen a gradual evolution towards simplicity that emphasizes timeliness over importance. Because I think that doing importance online the way that we do on a newspaper page is hard. It's easier just to go with what's the newest. Now, I want to begin by starting with a news site as a blog. And this is one of my favorite local news sites. It's called The Batavian. It started in upstate New York. Any of you from the Buffalo or Rochester areas? Any of you from Batavia? Okay. Well, Batavia is a small town right between Buffalo and Rochester. And It was started by an entrepreneur named Howard Owens. Actually, he was not an entrepreneur at the time. He was working for the Gatehouse chain, which is this chain of 300, 400 newspapers across the country. They own 100 local newspapers in eastern Massachusetts. And he wanted to start the Batavian as a demonstration project, an online-only community news site. Because he said, you know, the dead weight of all these newspapers is killing us. I want to show that we can make this work. And Gatehouse eventually decided that they did not need him anymore because they're under a crushing amount of debt and they're having problems, and they let him go. And he said, can I take the Batavian with me? And they said, oh, God, yes, please, take it with you. So he did, and he's now the owner of it. And what I want to point out, it's a little hard to tell without being able to scroll down. And he has a ton of advertising, which is a little bit distracting from the main idea that I want to point out. Although I do want to say, ton of advertising, this is a good thing. We all want a ton of advertising. And he actually has about 100 advertisers from the local community. But it's a blog. And he simply puts stuff up in reverse chronological order. And you might check in once a day. You might check in a couple of times a day. But what you do is you just go to the top and see what the latest is. It's very simple. It might be something of great importance. It might be something of no importance. But the idea of a blog type of organization is it really is a little bit too difficult to try to lay out everything according to its importance. So we're just going to do things in reverse chronological order, and people will take it as it comes. Now I want to show you a modified blog design. This is the New Haven Independent, my favorite online news site. I actually have a book coming out largely about the New Haven Independent in a couple of months. This is kind of a modified blog design where you get everything is still in reverse I can't say chronological today. Oh, I just said it. Everything is in reverse chronological order. You have the main news well that's where the photo is, and that's the most important news. Then you have a column of lesser news, also in reverse chronological order, that's called Extra Extra. And this might be routine police reports. It might be links to other news sites. Less important. So it's still, the idea is that it's organized as a blog, but you do get a more important track and a less important track. And it's kind of an interesting way of thinking of things. Now we have the Boston Globe. The Boston Globe, bostonglobe.com, which is the paid part of the Globe's online presence, uses something called responsive design. This does not mean as much to the user as it does to the designers, but this was considered a breakthrough. It debuted in the fall of 2010, 2011. It's 2010. It's considered somewhat routine now, but it was a breakthrough at the time. Responsive design is based on the latest version of the web language, HTML5. And what people do is, it's a design and publish once. And the site itself knows what you're reading it on. If you're reading it on a computer, it will look something like this. If you're reading it on a smartphone, it will automatically reformat itself to fit the smartphone. If you're doing an iPad, I mean, there's all kinds of these iterations. So that was really kind of a breakthrough. The Globe won the Society of News Design's major award the year this came out. And they said this is as big a breakthrough in news design as USA Today's introduction of color as a routine design element a generation earlier. So it may not impress you that much when you look at it, but what's under the hood is very impressive indeed. I just wanted to quickly show you this because I think that this is kind of a sign of failure. Replica editions, that is, on-screen representations of the print product, continue to be fairly popular in some circles. And what that tells me is that we're failing. We're not giving people the kind of compelling online experience that would wean them away from the print paradigm completely. So they keep going back to this. Now, it may just be a function of age. I don't know. Maybe older people like this. I'm an older person, and I don't like it particularly, but, you know, be that as it may. Now, the New York Times in particular has been a real innovator in many new ways of presenting the news. This is just one. It's called Times Skimmer. Times Skimmer is basically the iPad app for your computer. It's based on the same RSS feeds that the iPad and iPhone app are. And it's just an easier way of navigating the news than maybe the New York Times homepage is. They also have, as you may know, a terrific app for the iPad and iPhone. They also recently unveiled an HTML5 app, which I think is really nice. It's also very important in terms of revenue because when you sell something through the app, through iTunes, Apple grabs 30% off the top. If you can do an HTML app, as the Times has, and as the Globe does with its responsive design, Apple gets the donut, which is, from a publisher's point of view, exactly what Apple deserves. Now, I wanted to sort of close this conversation by talking about getting back to our original idea that web design is aimed at answering the wrong question. John Yema, the editor of the Christian Science Monitor, which sounds like a venerable old institution, and it is, but they're also on the leading edge of online journalism. They have gone online mostly. John Yema has said that only about a third of visitors to the Christian Science Monitor visit through the homepage. And this is a ratio that is pretty much standard throughout the news business. That's not unusual. 1/3 come in through social, email, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. 1/3 come in through search, primarily Google. I know this is shocking. You mean most of it isn't Bing? In fact, 2/3 of any news site's users, at least, are not even visiting this homepage that you put all this thought into designing. And design really ought to be aimed more at the social user. And so you see news organizations having robust Facebook presences and pretty good Twitter presences. But we don't really know what's going to come of that because there really isn't any revenue in that, is there? So we have the new front page. Here's the new front page, the most emailed list at NewYorkTimes.com. And that can be as interesting a guide to what you ought to be looking at as anything that the editors decide. An anti-authoritarian medium for an anti-authoritarian age. Sharing on social media places trust in those we know over the trust in editors. And then we end up with I.F. Stone's mocking description of the front page of the New York Times. I.F. Stone was this legendary journalist in the 50s, kind of a one-man operation. He put out a publication called I.F. Stone's Weekly. And because of the way he looks, he's great to just put up on a slide. You can say, look at that old guy. I'll bet he was pretty cool. And he was pretty cool. And what I.F. Stone liked to say is that the New York Times is the most exciting newspaper in the world. You never know where you're going to find a front page story. And he was saying that partly in frustration and partly in affection, I think. So those are some of the sources that I used, and that is the end of my presentation. So thank you. Okay, sure.
Well, I'd like to start by saying I think we made exactly the right choice in having you come in. I didn't know in advance exactly what angle you were going to approach this from, and I think it's great because you've really hit on the questioning the question idea that we've talked about several times as being one of the core skills that designers tackle. You know, we were chatting before the talk about the Steve Jobs book that we've read in here, and one of the things that's so great I gave a little initial presentation in this course and asked some questions like how, or rather pointed out, I suppose, that the nature of the questions around a number of things that are very familiar to us have changed dramatically over the years. For example, early on, what is a car? And a car was a carriage. It just didn't have horses in front of it. So what did it look like? Exactly like a carriage.
Yes.
And then later, you know, and it brought with it all the baggage of the carriage, the idea that the drivers were servants, the driver or drivers were servants who sat in a completely different kind of arrangement than you did in your Louis XIV chamber inside, protected from the elements and so forth. And those things translated into early cars. And cars were designed that way. Often we saw some that, you know, where even the chauffeur was in an unprotected environment, whereas the people in the back were protected. But all of this it has direct analog to your history of the evolution of the paper. And I think as we migrate into this conversation, one of the things that I learned, and I think you know because we've talked about this before, I'm a huge news junkie and have loved journalists and writing in all kinds of contexts. But the evolution of the penny paper, I wasn't really aware of how the technology changed around the 1830s that made that possible from those very limited circulation early bits. And I think that's really interesting. I think that maybe though in that first example, the difference in terms of, let's say, form and content doesn't seem to have been so great in that first transition from the Federal era to the penny paper. I mean, there's a lot more news there, but it doesn't look that different, does it? Or
it doesn't look that different. Certainly, the operators of the new mass media newspaper wanted to improve the look as quickly as they could, but the technology simply wasn't available.
Right.
But nevertheless, from rather sober pieces on public policy, or for that matter, partisan attacks, because the pre-1830s press was often an organ of one party or another,
right.
You nevertheless had downscale sensationalistic fare aimed at a mass market.
Right.
The New York Sun was the first penny press newspaper, but the first most successful one was the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett. And before Bennett, nobody had ever done a news interview before, not before the 1830s. And just to kind of show you what the penny press was all about, there had been a notorious murder in a house of ill repute. And Gordon went off and interviewed the madam. And that was considered to be the first newspaper interview ever conducted. So it may have looked similar, but the content was very different from what had come before it.
Right. Well, now see, that's really clarifying because in a way they're solving two different questions. One is a pamphlet for political purposes aimed at a very small elite, really, I guess, in the Federal era. And then the other one is trying to seek a mass market. Well, that's excellent. I think maybe the way to delve into some of the, I have a bunch of questions, some of which are going to try to tie to the kinds of questions we've asked others. And of course, you think this is, I get a kick out of, lots of the people who have been guests in this class already think, wow, that's interesting you invited me. Actually, I think all of these people are designing because they're answering questions, or they're actually moving upstream a bit. And we talked about this on the way over. In some ways, this design thinking is really about understanding the nature of problems earlier on in the process, so you make sure all your subsequent questions are in the right general area. So let's dive into one thing that I found fascinating here. First of all, as a consumer of online news myself, of course, and the Replica editions versus the various other kinds, I still hadn't thought as clearly as you presented it about the fundamental differences between a home page and the front page. That the front page is absolutely making a whole bunch more decisions for you, at least the traditional front page. And the initial and the early home page was about making all options available at the same time. So at some level, this entire conversation is really about organization. It's about, you alluded to some of the inherent advantages of the print newspaper, and you didn't say it explicitly, but I assume you mean like the fact that it's divided into sections.
Yes.
And that the front page has once you've picked up the front page, the front section, you've already made a sorting decision that you haven't yet made on the home page. But you got to this last stage with the globe online and the responsive design, and you anticipated. I thought, oh gosh, when you got to that, this tool that is responsive and responds to different formats. Okay, that makes tons of sense. That's a problem that needed to be solved, because otherwise, you can only just have some links, and and you don't get to organize it as much as you like.
Right.
But responsive design, I immediately wrote down then content. When are you going to make the responsive design responsive to my desire for one kind of content and your desire for another kind of content? And the answer is through this emailed.
Through the email, that's right. And this doesn't speak directly to design, and yet maybe it does. Because another enormous problem that I really didn't even bring up is that, what do we call this? There's a term for it. I can't think of it, so it really doesn't. Oh, disaggregation. Mm-hmm. And that is, the newspaper is an artifact of the industrial age. Mm-hmm. And it comprises a lot of things that logically don't belong together, unless you're talking about an era in which you need one mass medium that gathers it all together. Mm-hmm. There is no earthly reason for international and local news to be together, for the funnies and the school lunch menus to be together, for the Wednesday food ads. Do they still have Wednesday food ads? I don't even know. And the obits to be together.
Right.
And in fact, online, you have the Globe struggling mightily to keep those things together, but the forces pulling them apart are far greater than the forces keeping them together. I feel as though at my age, I'm exactly in the middle. I'm young enough that I'm absolutely fine with it all moving online, but I'm old enough that I still like the fact that there is the Globe. And I don't think people much younger than you and I are care about that. They're getting their news from what their friends are sharing with them on Facebook and on Twitter, what they see on email. And it may come from a dozen different news sources.
Right. Well, but this is where we get to the real, I think, the nub of one of the issues around journalism. And that is, what is, and this is something about sort of questioning the question. It's true that if the problem I'm trying to solve is that all of our citizens know what the weather's going to be, know who's running for president, know what the tax rates are, know how the Patriots are doing at outside, linebacker, and so forth, that if all those things can get solved either from 10 different sites or in one, if that's the only challenge, then the disaggregation absolutely, it has no opponents then. But of course, that's not the only thing newspapers do. And not to get squishy here, but of course one of the things that we found that they did when they aggregated this all together in the industrial age is that they provided a common identity or a common point of view or a common reference point, let's say. Not a common point of view, because people might hurl tomatoes at the paper, but they nonetheless, it was the baseline for public conversation on almost any topic. Well, and as we know, we are talk about generations. This generation is experiencing what the consequences of that disaggregation are culturally. That there isn't any, first of all, that people don't have lost the ability to talk to those of different points of view because they don't ever have to. All my friends on Facebook agree with me. I don't know what's wrong with the country, but everybody agrees with me. And I read a paper or I get my news from sources like that. I wonder, and I got a kick out of, I just made a couple of notes myself about how these papers that were also maybe doubling as communities, how they identified themselves. The New York Times, that is the Times that we live in, or the Boston Globe, I'm going to give you, access to the world in this one paper, or the Honolulu Advertiser. I always got a kick out of the fact that they made no pretense whatsoever
That's right.
of doing anything, having advertisements. I guess I don't know what paper is going to serve that.
That's World News.
World
News Tonight. Otherworldly News Tonight. Well, you make a good point, but what about our grandparents grew up in an era where they might have 10 or 12 newspapers to choose from.
Right.
And each one of those newspapers represented a certain social class and a certain political point of view. So what you and I may be nostalgic for with one, maybe 1.5 dominant daily newspapers in our community, Uncle Walter telling us that this is the way it is, that was a fairly brief moment. That our grandparents didn't really experience.
Right. Well, that's true, but I'm constantly trying to diagram things like this, and I guess the complexity of the world you live in versus the commonality or the synthesis that occurs in the news organ. Maybe they didn't need to synthesize as much because the world was less complicated 100 years ago than it is today in terms of all the things that a reasonably educated person feels obliged to know. I don't know if that's a fair assessment, but you know what I mean? If you think about, I often make the point in architecture classes about Thomas Jefferson. You can reasonably make the case that Thomas Jefferson was really the last person who could make any claim at knowing all that was worth knowing in the world, because knowledge exploded so much after that, and that his library was like Hadrian's, like the Emperor Hadrian's library before his, a compendium of pretty much everything that we knew in the world up to that point. But then quickly after that, knowledge expanded so dramatically that was just not possible. Yes. So I think there's a couple of arcs here, and one of them is just the complexity. But I wonder. Well, let me
pick up on that for a moment, because there's an aspect of news design that I think picks up on this different experiences for everyone that I could have mentioned in my talk and I didn't, and that is news organizations increasingly are trying to give their users interactive and non-linear experiences so that everybody can experience it in a different way. And a simple way of doing that is you might have a map with various points on the map, and you go to what interests you. And you might go back repeatedly, which gets around one of the problems of news online, which is that people tend to stop in for 10 or 12 seconds and move on. This invites you to move back. The Washington Post, I don't know if any of you saw this, they did a wonderful interactive right after the president's inauguration last week, where they took this unbelievably high density photo. It was 305 photos taken over a series of 13 minutes and spliced them all together, and you could maneuver around it and look at individual faces in the crowd. But then on top of that, they gave you the option, if you were there, of labeling yourself. And
like a giant Facebook photo.
yeah, exactly. And in fact, you were encouraged to log in using your Facebook account.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have this news as community, news as conversation, which is really what the web is best at.
Right, right. Well, that's great.
Although the news value, admittedly, is rather small, but
well, but apropos your point earlier about the 3 reasons, or you gave us, one is to 3 reasons for the traditional paper. I guess the front page of the traditional paper was 1, to communicate the editor's take on the world, to afford, and I guess this was the traditional newspaper in general, to afford the ability to read and skim. And as a dedicated newspaper reader, that cannot be overstated, and that was one of the many stumbles that the transition into online made. It presumed that we wanted to read, if we were interested in something, we wanted to read whole articles only, and of course that's nobody who, when you see people reading the paper like this, they are not all Evelyn Wood speed reading dynamics graduates.
Right.
In fact, they are just skimming. But the third one is the marketing tool. And so this photo, this giant Facebook photo, surely, well, you know what? It's going to get me to go to the Washington Post site because that sounds super interesting. But let me migrate. I mean, we've in our sort of intro remarks, we have addressed this a little bit already. What I had down here to ask you, what do you see as the primary task of journalism today, and how has it changed? Well, obviously, your presentation covered a significant amount of that, but still, actually, some of these questions, even about the responsive journalism, about the New Haven thing, I mean, I guess maybe you would disaggregate what we traditionally called the newspaper into a few different parts, and maybe we can just recapitulate what those parts would be.
Well, I mean, I think that we're already seeing this to a large extent, which is the Boston Globe traditionally had the best sports section in the country, and it's still pretty good. But half of the former Globe staff is now at various sports-only niche websites. We see a ton of political websites. That's been kind of depressing, by the way, because either they're almost pure opinion, or they take shallowness to a new level. So that's been a little bit depressing. I'd still rather get my political news from the New York Times, thank you very much. International news. We see Boston. I could give a whole talk on what's going on in international news in Boston, because there's like 4 projects worth watching. But the big for-profit project in Boston is something called Global Post, which is the editor is a former legendary foreign correspondent for the Boston Globe. The Globe no longer has any foreign bureaus, and yet Global Post, which has its headquarters right here in the North End, has reporters in 50 or 60 countries around the world. And one of the things they're doing is they're supplying to newspapers what they can no longer do. They just signed a deal with the company that owns the New Haven Register, the competitor to the New Haven Independent. So there's a lot of different things going on like that. The problem with all of these things is who pays. You sometimes hear crusty old people in my business who never really picked up on exactly what the debate was, who say, well, there's the information wants to be free crowd, ha, ha, ha. And well, the fact is, when we started down this road in the mid-90s, it was perfectly reasonable to suppose that if we could get rid of the legacy costs of printing, if we could get rid of the legacy costs of distribution, then there was no reason we couldn't give away the news and support it with advertising. what we did not anticipate was that the advertising market was going to collapse, also because of the internet. That's what happened. And Clay Shirky, who is a professor at New York University, and sort of a media futurist kind of guy, is one of the things he likes to say. In fact, he wrote this, I believe he wrote this in his book, Here Comes Everybody, is that Walmart did not sign on to support the Baghdad Bureau. Walmart supported the Baghdad Bureau simply because it had to in order to get its message out. And now it has any number of more effective ways to get its message out. So the big challenge that we face, whether you're talking about a niche news site or something that's still trying to do a more general proposition like the Boston Globe, is who's going to pay. And there's a question that we don't have an answer to yet. And of course, our big fear is maybe there isn't an answer.
Well, I mean, a few things that you just said. First of all, the Global Post thing, just to be clear, is essentially, and stop me if I make a mistake, is the outsourcing of all those foreign correspondents that used to be, let's say, in the thousands at all the various big city papers in the United States, to a group of maybe like 50, spread all over the country, and they're like the AP or the United Press International.
Yes, and I don't want to make it sound too Pollyanna-ish. The people that Global Post has are primarily young freelancers. And or if they are older and more experienced journalists, they do Global Post on the side with what they normally do for somebody else. But nevertheless, it's been a real boon at a time when international news is getting cut back.
Well, this was a way of reinventing international coverage for this new environment.
Exactly.
And you implied it, and just to be clear, the lethal blow to, or not lethal, let's say, but the very damaging blow to newspapers in the 90s was when Craigslist came on the scene.
Absolutely.
I don't know if students really realize that the relationship between the arrival of Craigslist and the demise of newspapers is one-to-one. I mean,
it's unbelievable. Newspapers, you know, they're almost so hard to find. I don't know how many of you have seen them anymore. But the classified ads, the little bitty type that you find, that used to carry 40% of a newspaper's revenues. And you'd get the Sunday Globe on your porch. You'd need 3 people to carry it into the house. and it would be section after section after section of classified ads for job listings. I worked for many years for the Boston Phoenix. It's now a glossy magazine called The Phoenix. You may have seen it. I still recommend it. It's terrific. But the Phoenix was, and the alternative press in general, was supported by page after page of classified ads. Our band needs a bass player. I need a roommate. I need a girlfriend. No, I mean, that's what the ads were, and it was very lucrative, and those are all gone now.
I mean, and that
by the way, I don't need a girlfriend. I'm married.
It's a well, that sort of the cultural value that exists in various kinds of inefficiencies. We forget this as we aim for efficiency as our only objective. I think. I mean, I think that's a perfect example. Is that it was for generations, and maybe it was a golden age in the 20th century, but for generations, people didn't think about what was paying for what. They just loved that they got the aggregated thing as a whole.
That's right.
About the newspaper.
Exactly. Sure.
So, so I want there are some. By the way, our list of 8 words. I don't know if any of you noticed that there were only 7 of them. Yeah. Okay. I thought that was a fair. I would say in doing your course evaluation, I think you should bring that up. I think that's a pretty egregious failing. If your instructor says the most important thing for you to know about this course is these 8 words and there are only 7, I think that's almost legally actionable. So I'm happy to put you in touch with a law professor if you want to make a case. But some of these words I've added the word design somewhat sheepishly so that it adds up to 8 now. Okay, just FYI.
Add responsive.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to work on these, but I feel in this course we need full disclosure. So these words, I think I shared them with you, Dan. Are design, context, question, empathy, iteration, metaphor, visualization, and synthesis. And these are all words that end up having significant resonance with across these different disciplines. They're intended to be general enough that they are applicable to architects, but also to software people and drug designers. And our next guest is a business strategist and all this sort of thing. But so we've already talked actually about design a bit because you were explicitly looking at the graphic design of the sheets, the newspapers themselves, from the sort of the pamphlets to broadsheets. I guess the penny paper was what you would call a broadsheet. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then tabloids and
the late federal papers were broadsheets as well.
I see. Okay.
And they used to be a lot broader than they are today.
Because they were a single sheet, right?
No.
No.
But they were just wider.
Wow.
They were much wider. One of the ways that newspapers have tried to save money over the last 20 years is they keep shaving a little bit off the width.
I remember that.
And then making the type a little bit smaller. When I started in the business in 1975, as a Northeastern co-op student, I should add, at the Woonsocket Call down in Rhode Island, now they were an anomaly even then, but they were the widest thing I've ever seen in my life. I couldn't believe it. It was like this.
Right.
And it's gradually gotten narrower and narrower and narrower in order to save money. But it's reached the point where, frankly, it really doesn't matter, because I think that the print edition kind of ought to be looked at as kind of like a best of what they're doing across all their platforms.
Right. Well, I remember, as growing up in Chicago, when it was still a 4-newspaper town in the 60s. There was a morning paper and an afternoon paper, and 2 competing ones for each one. And we had the tabloid, just like New York. We had the more august Chicago Tribune, and then we had the Wilder Sun-Times and the Daily News also.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Mike Royko, of course, wrote for the Daily News, and that was the one I always read assiduously. But let's I mean, there's this whole business about the literal design of the paper and of the web page is super interesting, because it does make you realize how much of what a newspaper is organization. It's hierarchy. Is this, as you pointed out so well, is this a sort of view from authority of the early federal paper, maybe, but even let's say the New York Times or the London Times or any other significant and historically important newspaper. You read it because it's there's a point of view. You may not agree with it, but it's a point of view. It's a point of view to be taken seriously. And that hierarchy is completely set in the newspaper form. And I'm just so curious and interested by how this further disaggregation, even of the authority within the paper itself, is taking place now. And this is something that I hadn't even thought of. It seemed innocuous to me. Another little feature on my New York Times app, most emailed. Well, actually, that's a completely different. That has the top thing might not be the recent Supreme Court decision. The top thing might be nude woman swims English Channel or something like that. In other words, it's a completely different hierarchy.
I would read that story.
Yeah, of course. Who wouldn't read that story? I don't know if it exists, but we'll make sure to write it if it happens. But it makes you realize that this transformation is really culturally meaningful, and not just. I mean, one could infer from your presentation, because you are so close to the business of the news, and have an on-the-ground understanding of all of these decisions. One could infer that this is entirely a struggle for a viable business model, which of course it fundamentally is.
Absolutely.
but as we zoom out as consumers who are not in the news business, it's also maybe a struggle for figuring out what vehicle is going to play the social role that this aggregated.
Have you noticed what's missing from your iPhone and iPad app for the New York Times? You can get most emailed. What can't you get that you would most like?
What other people are reading? No, that is it.
That is it, yeah. Today's front page.
Yeah.
It's missing.
Yeah.
It's missing. The latest news, which is the first thing that they give you, it's going to be different an hour from now and a different an hour now. Now, I told you that they've come up with this HTML5 app. They have an alternate view that gives you today's paper.
Right.
And again, I think
the Replica.
No, it's not the Replica.
Okay.
It's for the web.
Right.
But it's today's paper.
I see. And it stays today's paper all day.
And it stays today's paper all day, and I like having that. Again, I think it's my age. Right. I once saw Neil Postman he actually engaged in a dialogue on stage with Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the publisher of the Times. This was just as we were heading down this road in the mid-'90s. Right. And Postman said to Sulzberger, he considered the front page of the New York Times to be one of the most important cultural documents that we have. Mm-hmm. And he said, it's not because I agree with the choices. I usually disagree. Mm-hmm. But this is our common reference point for deciding what to argue about. I don't think this is important. You should have put this on the front page instead. And we are losing that. We are losing that. And maybe it's okay, but we are losing it.
No, I have a very similar sense that, whenever I've talked about this sort of commonality thing, people immediately say, well, even today, in Europe, in much of Europe, certainly in Italy, a place I'm somewhat familiar with, the newspapers are wildly partisan and completely, the idea that there's a common agreement, they would scoff.
Or the UK.
Yeah.
I wrote for The Guardian for a few years, and it was like liberalism unbound. I could hardly keep up.
Very good. Well, okay, so with regard to context, we've talked about the changing economic environment for newspapers, the elimination of classified ads, the exposure of cross-subsidies that existed in the news that we weren't maybe aware of. What I mean by that is that the classified ads were supporting our foreign correspondents, and we didn't, those of us not in that business never even really thought about it that way. So why should Craigslist be a threat to the Baghdad Bureau? And yet, there it is. I have a note here about the real public role for newspapers is, in a way, at this time of crisis, clarified, in the sense that because you are having to redesign the idea of the newspaper, it's not just, if this were just about the periodic graphic redo that has occurred all through our lives in newspapers and magazines. I remember, if you subscribe to a magazine for any period of time, you inevitably see it completely reimagined in the first time you get there.
And they always say, we've made it much more readable.
Yeah.
And I always say, well, why did you bother to pay the bill to your last redesigner? Right.
No. I mean, actually, they always end up being fine, but I realized how closed-minded I actually was, as I imagined myself to be completely open-minded. Whenever a newly designed magazine would arrive, I would just be appalled. This is not the same as it was before, and this is an outrage. But clarifying journalism's, clarifying the public role, and then this changing we're still talking about the word context, the changing landscape, again, to which you have alluded, of opinion, fact, propaganda, etc. I wonder if in this change that I feel like we're still very much in the midst of, I wonder if you think those things are going to shake out, in a clearer way. In other words, I think most of us, can I assume that most of us reading news today see it as having certainly been disaggregated. That is, that people can go to, if you're you know, if I have one political point of view and you have another, I can just hang out only in my world and you can only hang out in yours. I think many people think that's problematic. Do you see that shaking out as this evolution continues? In other words, do you see any, like, for example, in your focus on New Haven Online, which is, I think, fascinating and interesting, is representative of a major trend that even I have discerned, which is that the only way to do for local news organizations to really work today is to really focus on local things and get into far greater depth than any large organization could ever do.
Yes. Yes.
Because there's 10,000 people telling you about the healthcare vote at the Supreme Court. You're not going. That's not a fight you're going to win.
No.
So you need to separate that out.
Although if you can do it better than anybody else, like SCOTUS blog has done.
Well, that's right. Everybody referred to that.
Right.
That's
exactly.
Actually, in a way, further disaggregation.
Yes.
We're
exactly.
only going to be about interpreting Supreme Court opinions.
That's
then
right.
There's going to be another website that's only about determining the quality of left-handed pitchers.
But let's not forget what the most important source of income for the New Haven Independent is. It's a nonprofit, and the money is coming from local foundations and individuals who want to support good local journalism in the community. There really isn't a very good way of paying for that just through advertising. The other project that I put up was the Batavian, and that's for profit. And what you have is poor Howard Owens, he's making a living, but he spends all his time chasing around after pizza shop owners and funeral homes and everything else to try to get them to advertise, and there's barely any time left over to do journalism.
So, in fact, this is interesting. This is, and I've heard about this, that there are various efforts to address maybe this public role of journalism to which I've been alluding through grant-funded or some other business model that is not like the Hearst-era newspaper.
That's exactly right,
And
yes.
that's really interesting.
Well, of course,
so
it's
disaggregating that from those things that could be profitable.
Of course, we've been accustomed to getting our news from NPR for a long time, and it's the same model.
Right,
but this is trying to do it at the very local level.
Right. Excuse me. That's super interesting, and that's really a design issue that is yet to be resolved. I mean, we've been talking more about the graphic design in a way than the business design, the enterprise that you're working on. So now we've already now as we migrate into the realm of the question, what question am I trying to answer? Definition of the problem. This is something that we've been really focusing on in the course, and we've talked, I think, a fair amount about that with regard to the news and papers today. Now, is there any, at this late date, knowing your involvement in online, developing online stuff, and by the way, we should pitch dankennedy.net, is that what it is?
dankennedy.net, yes. If you go to dankennedy.com, you'll get the Get Rich Quick guy in Arizona.
right. dankennedy.net, he's got a great blog that I'm checking out.
Thank you. Your check is in the mail.
Yes, absolutely. This is our business model.
Yes.
Right? This is business model for this class.
Yes.
But given your commitment to that, is there any news you think? This is a nutty question, but is there any news you think that papers can provide better? And maybe they are just different platforms of the same thing now. So that's just a moot point.
I suppose a few years ago, I would have said that long-form journalism was better on paper because it could be such an unpleasant experience to sit hunched in front of your computer and read a 5,000-word story.
Right.
But I can't even say that now because if you kick back with your iPad, it's a perfectly pleasant experience.
Right.
Maybe another angle of looking at it is there a role for print moving forward?
Right.
And I think there is. I think that the predictions had been that by now print would be gone, and it's not even close to being gone. And I think that what has happened is that print itself has emerged as a niche product.
Right.
The Globe has done something very smart, and that is they've said, we're gonna jack up the price of the print edition until it hurts.
Right.
And people who are willing to pay for the convenience of print, they can continue to have print. And that's helped their bottom line. And it's still where most of the valuable advertising is. So it helps in that regard too. So I think that as a niche product, print is probably going to be with us for quite a while to come, even though I have since ceased looking at it as the main event.
Right. So, maybe like vinyl, the hipsters will develop a kind of retro appreciation for newspapers the same way they have for vinyl records.
Oh, well, that's certainly what newspaper owners are hoping. Right now, it seems to have a great appeal to people in their 60s and older.
Right, alas, right. Who still have the Victrola.
Yes. They also have an appreciation for vinyl, but they are unaware that
it's ironic. Right. Alas. So, as we close out this section on sort of understanding the question, this is something that I think we've talked about in the context of planning for our college. Dan and I are in the journalism and architecture of the same College of Arts, Media and Design. And that is, what is journalism's central role? Is it to report? Is it to document? Is it to investigate? We have as some of you may know, another pitch for the School of Journalism, Walter Robinson, who has led some of the most significant investigative reporting in this country. He's played a very significant role in breaking the clergy sex abuse case.
Right.
He's an amazing investigative reporter. Teaches that here, and they do investigative reporting with students for the Globe. It's fantastic. But so report, document, investigate, or a term that came to me recently, I don't know what's it, verify. At some level, the core business, it seems to me, of the newspaper as a public it is not, it turns out, to supply information, because I get information just everywhere. Now, it's to verify and to confirm for us that something is in fact the case. What do you think about that?
I think that's an important part of what professional journalism is. And one of the more interesting developments that is taking place in journalism right now is, what do you do when there's a natural disaster in Indonesia? What do you do when there's an uprising in Egypt? And there is a flood of social media coming out. And you can't really be sure if it's coming from the scene or from the basement of somebody's mother in Brooklyn. So I think that one of the most powerful developments that we've seen in recent years is good news organizations putting really good people on the idea of aggregating and curating this torrent of citizen media that's coming at us. Because it's not like it's without value. In fact, it's of great value if you can find the stuff that's real and the stuff that's important and interesting. So we've seen the New York Times do that with the Lead blog, they call it, L-E-D-E, where they try to make sense of social media. The Guardian is very good at it. The master is Andy Carvin of NPR. When the Arab uprising began 2 years ago, he's not a journalist, but he already had an enormous number of contacts in the Middle East. And he started following them on Twitter, and he would see who they were following. And pretty soon he had basically real-time citizen media, reliable stuff on what was going on in the Arab uprising. Just absolutely fascinating.
Now that is a redesign of a whole approach, much more innovative, I would say, let's say, than not to take the Global Post is perhaps a innovative business model.
Yes.
But this is an innovative design that is like using network. We're going to have a guy who is an expert on network design coming from the lab of what's his name? Laszlo Barabin. here at Northeastern, leading network scientist in the leading age of information.
Oh, and by the way, since we brought this up in the context of verification, one thing Andy Carvin will do is, okay, there's a lot of crap that people might even put in front of him.
Right.
But there are a number of things that pop up when he'll say, this is worth sharing, I don't know if it's true.
Right, right.
And sometimes doing that ends up being part of the process of verification.
Right, 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 right. Well, that, the whole idea of curatorship on the web is inevitably going to happen in lots of ways because obviously, as everybody here knows, you Google something, you get congratulations, we have 17 billion things for you to look at. Yeah. I hope you've got some time. They've gotten better, search has gotten, you guys don't really know, when it first started it was really awful. And it's way, 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 way better now.
Well, when we first started, you were only going to get 1 or 2 websites, no matter what you searched.
Maybe you were searching before I was, but it's gotten a lot better. But the need for curating is, I guess that's the pushback from in the other direction. In other words, if the distribution, the disaggregation is a natural consequence of the digitization and pixelization of everything. But now that we have disaggregated everything, and cross-subsidies have been exposed, and therefore things fall under their own weight that were being supported by other parts of the paper. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we're going to see some business models and curatorship models that actually make sense. And that seems to me a logical direction.
Absolutely.
Because we can't, there's hardly anything that we get access to through the web that doesn't require significant curating, either by us or by somebody else, because it's just too much.
That's right.
And I like this idea about saying it's not going to be a binary true-false thing about the information about the Arab Spring, for example, but rather, it's going to be a rating. This source has got 5 stars, and that already happens on TripAdvisor and all these other things. So this is going to probably get leveraged into our ability. Now let's turn a little bit. I'm going to give the students a chance to ask some questions here in a few minutes. But regarding this question of empathy, this might seem like an odd term to you in this context of design, but it's really about assuming the role of the consumer or user. And so, and you do that obviously implicitly in your analysis of why things are where they are. Okay? And so I divided empathy into 3 categories for your purposes. One of them is, what do people need to know? Let's just say, the weather, government, crime, safety, things like that. Those are probably things they really need to know. What do they want to know? Sports, gossip, food, entertainment. And then what do they enjoy about the paper? I think those are, and whether it's online or otherwise, I wonder if that is a framework, and I'm sure it is, because they must be, especially since the explosion of the web and the dramatic need for self-reassessment, they must be doing studies, just study after study, about what people want. But is there anything that would surprise us about what people like, or what draws them most to the paper or to the news websites?
Not necessarily aware of. I'm not up on the state of research on doing that. Certainly in putting together a traditional front page, and you can really see this in the Globe. It isn't just the most important news of the day. It's also the most important local news of the day, plus stuff that they think you want to know. Lots of sports.
Right.
I find that when students are introduced to the Globe for the first time and they start looking at it, they're very surprised, and sometimes they're even kind of appalled by how much sports the Globe puts on the front page.
Right.
It's like, this just isn't that important. They're just anecdotally, in terms of what the internet has exposed, that people are really, really interested in, that we might not have known, I would say videos of cats.
Right? Who would have been able to predict that that would have been the $17 billion?
Yeah, exactly. You can't go wrong with videos of cats.
Right. Okay, so those of you who are considering starting a news website.
A lot of competition.
Right. Another issue that I think will be relevant to the students.
Oh, and by the way, I should finish that answer because it's a very good question. When we talk about disaggregation, and we talk about the important, the fun, and all of this, it also kind of disaggregates the important from the fun. And so if you're talking about the kind of information that we need to govern ourselves in a democratic society, that kind of becomes the spinach and broccoli sense, doesn't it?
Right.
And it becomes a real challenge to make that interesting and to engage in.
Right. It used to be that I got drawn to the material by the story about Rajon Rondo. And then I read it because it was on the same page.
That's right, exactly. Now that's all gone.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Having to make even the most prosaic aspects of our self-government sexy and interesting.
Exactly.
One more thing that I wanted to get at before I open it up to the students is, we've talked a lot about something that I figured would not be relevant in the journalism application, and that is about the difference between a one-off design and a prototypical solution. What I mean by that is a customized, one-of-a-kind, I'm going to design for you a customized, one-of-a-kind, handmade wooden chair with leather surfaces and so forth, made for your body that I'm going to give to you to have in your house. And he's going to design a chair for Knoll Furniture is going to be made 15,000 times. And how are those different? And it actually is very meaningful in architecture and in other kinds of design because it's almost two completely different professions. In fashion, in England they would say bespoke or off the peg, and meaning custom made or from off the rack. And so it matters a great deal. We talk about ready to wear versus haute couture, and it's a very meaningful distinction because if designers spend too much of their time on the one-off, they're not taking on the larger challenges that are more, let's say, scalable.
Yeah.
So newspapers are all about having multiple copies. So how could you ever talk about this? Well, a bell really went off when you showed that typical Gannett 1970s template for the front page, because suddenly, in fact, newspapers, even though they made many copies of them and stuff, they did look more meaningfully different. The Baltimore Sun, which I lived there for a while and just fell in love with, had a totally different look than the Chattanooga Times.
Sure.
But once those papers started to get owned by the same people, they literally used a template like we now use on the web.
Yes.
And the front pages looked the same. They had the same sans serif kinds of title blocks. And so anyway, I just thought that was a really interesting, and I was glad that you pointed out that it was another tipping point in the change you might not have noticed if you weren't paying attention. But the idea of that sort of template form that made papers even less relevant to their local community.
I mentioned that Gatehouse owns about 100 papers in eastern Massachusetts. Most of them are weeklies, and all of them have exactly the same design.
Yeah. And, in the answer to one question, you can understand why.
Yes.
Right? Why reinvent them? It's like we've got the Chevrolet Impala. Why are we going to put have different size nuts and bolts in its assembly? No. We're going to assemble it the same way, and we'll gain tremendous efficiency. But it turns out there are costs.
Well, there are huge costs. I mean, they destroy themselves building their chain. They are struggling under $1.2 billion worth of debt. They can't pay.
Okay, I think rather than talk about having the students ask us some questions, I will shift it to that. So, Who's got our first question? Yeah. Oh, yes, you do. Thank you for reminding me. This is really turning into a self-serve class.
So I'm wondering, we're living, at least that's how I feel, we're living through an era of personalization online. How do you see that happening in the newspaper world? Do you see newspapers letting users log in with their Facebook account, let's say, and then serving them personalized content based on how they interact? I mean, that's what we see Google doing more or less now with personalized search results. How do you see that happening in the user world?
You know, that's an interesting question, and I guess my answer would be that we have not seen that happen to the extent that we might have predicted 10 years ago. There used to be a lot of talk about, well, news organizations are moving toward the daily need. And I haven't seen that as much as we thought was going to happen. And I think it's because most news consumers put a higher premium on serendipity than we might have supposed. They want to be introduced to things that surprise them. Now, I think the way that is developed is the daily need imagines all of us acting as individuals and we're not part of a community. And I think that we're very much acting as part of a community, but what we become open to is not necessarily the serendipity of the story that happens to be laid out alongside the story we thought we were interested in, but the serendipity of friends on Facebook and Twitter or just by email saying, hey, you have to read this, and it's not something that you necessarily knew that you were interested in, but you read it and say, okay, well, this is interesting. I'm glad I read it. So I kind of think that serendipity is alive and well. And I have not really seen news organizations do the kind of customization that you're talking about particularly. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't set up your RSS reader and have all of the New York Times political stories delivered to you, or all of the media stories. But, you know, I think a lot of us who really care about journalism were very concerned about the emergence of the daily need, and I just haven't seen it happen. Not the way we thought it was going to happen, and I'm very glad about that.
You know, this is interesting. I recently got an app called Longform. Have you seen this?
I know of it. I haven't.
It's really interesting. It's not exactly what you're asking, but you know, in a way, your question is one. We now live in an era of both and, not either or.
Yes.
So that, like, you know, the newspaper is playing this collective role. There's still somewhat collective role, but you still have the freedom to go to the very focused sites that Dan was referring to. What's interesting about Longform is that it's a reader. You can subscribe. I don't understand how it works. I don't understand who's paying for the subscriptions of the New Yorker and various things that are in this thing. I just had to add them to this list. I've got the Design Observer and the New Yorker and a bunch of other things. And what it allows you to do is somehow it goes to their website, extracts the stories, and puts them in exactly the same kind of format. So it feels like you have a magazine composed of the 14 magazines that you're interested in. And
do they pick the articles for you?
Well, I haven't compared the table of contents, let's say, of the New Yorker for this week with the contents that are available to me. It might be limited, but I don't know. It's, you know what? The old days of magazine subscription, I don't know if it must be different now, but when I first got out of college, I went crazy subscribing to magazines. I thought, I can get whatever I want. And, you know, I'll read whatever. I got 6 magazines or 8 magazines on a regular basis. And, of course, you know what happened. I was quick. It was like an episode of hoarding or something. You know, suddenly my house was filling up with all this paper, and I couldn't possibly keep up because it turns out I had a job and some other things that were impinging on my magazine reading time. So I spent much of my adult life trying to prune magazine subscriptions for domestic tranquility reasons, for housekeeping reasons. And now, suddenly, I have this thing that allows me to get access to them sort of, as much as I want, but without any clutter. It's an astonishing thing. I would encourage you to check it out. It's very interesting.
I use something called Instapin, and this is not done automatically, but if I'm sitting in front of my computer and I see a really long story and I say, I don't want to read this sitting in front of my computer, I can just press a button and it magically shows up, beautifully formatted, and I can read it on an iPad or an iPhone later.
Very nice. Other questions?
For a lot of people, Instapaper has kind of become the new stacks of magazines.
Yes. Come on. It's nice that it takes up this space.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you all very much.